No, I mean, they're talking about in proportional terms.
Right.
The African economies have grown enormously over the last 3 decades. And the issue is that the manufacturing sector and industrial sectors have not expanded at the same rate. It doesn't mean they haven't grown. So, I mean, in absolute terms, of course, the manufacturing sectors are much larger than they were 30 years ago. But the problem is, proportionately, they've been shrinking. And we see this across the East African community, for example. We see countries where the share of GDP manufacturing has stagnated or declined even over recent years.
Now, the report also goes on to say, which is also what we're discussing today, in 2014, manufacturing contributed 9% on average to Africa's GDP, a quarter lower than 1990. So this means that even as we go into AFCFTA and the execution of it, there is an actual growth that has been there. It's not triggered by this particular agreement.
No, indeed. No, I mean, the manufacturing sector has been growing, but it's been under quite a bit of stress, I would say, over the last 10, 15 years in particular. Import competition, for example. If you see the pattern of trade, for example, for the East Africa community, the rise of imports from China has been quite dramatic. That's been one issue. Right. It also reflects a relative failure of industrial policy, I believe. Industrial policy hasn't been pursued vigorously enough in the region. We have one counterexample, I think, which is quite impressive. Ethiopia, over the last 5 or 6 years, has really made some impressive strides in terms of developing its industrial parks. But we'd like to see more of those kind of developments across the region.
All right. Speaking of policy, most of the time when we discuss this, or even budget for it within our borders, it's normally national policy that is addressed. So regional policy and shifting from the same is painful, and we've touched on it with you. Kenya is on, the MPs are debating it currently. But what do you think is the most uncomfortable bit, leave alone the political will, because we've dealt with that. What is more uncomfortable in dealing with this set of policies?
Could I ask for a clarification? Which set of policy? For industrial policy in general?
For industrial policy in general, trying to execute that across the border.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we're moving to a panorama where national industrial policies, we need to move on a step and start talking about regional industrial policies. Right. And that's why ECA is so enthusiastic about the Continental Free Trade Area. But also about regional integration processes in general. So there is an EAC, industrialization plan. Because what we really have to incentivize is cross-border trade amongst our countries where there's more trade of intermediate products, for example. Right. So all countries explicitly have some plans to boost their manufacturing. But we think there's an issue of critical mass there. And the fact that countries working together will have more chance of success in very competitive global markets. I mean, if you compare India and China, for example, those are integrated markets, and they're massive. The population size is fairly similar to that of Africa, but our markets are much more fragmented still. So this is why we feel very strongly that the African Continental Free Trade Area is a positive step forward. And we were very happy that there were 44 countries signing up. I think before the AU summit, people weren't predicting that there would be that positive reception amongst so many countries. Right. So going forward, we're hoping that this will give a boost to industrialization. Now, the calculations of our colleagues suggest that it could boost intra-African trade by more than 50%, which would be a very positive development. So currently, we're talking about intra-regional trade across Africa of about 18%. Right. Which is pretty low by international standards. I mean, if you compare it with Asian countries, 60, 70, in parts of ASEAN. So it would boost that to maybe 30%. Right. And the colleagues also stress in some of the simulations that they've done that if we reduce the non-tariff barriers as well, we could double that amount. So we'd be getting into the region of 45% of African trade would be intra-regional trade. I think that would give us a much more firm basis for the industrialization and the diversification of the economies in the continent. We've
tried to map out market schemes or market access schemes, and we've pitted ourselves against the EU and the World Trade Organization, Commerce SADC here, what's been happening. So what's the preferred scheme? We still haven't placed it in our newsrooms or otherwise.
Yes, well, you and we were discussing the case of Rwanda a couple of weeks ago, were we not, with the suspension from AGOA. The problem with preferential market access is that it's not binding. It can be lifted, as we've seen in the case of Rwanda. So if there's some kind of dispute amongst the two parties, preferential market access can make a country quite vulnerable. And we've seen that, for example, in cases like Madagascar. They built up their textile industry, but in 2008 suffered a suspension from AGOA,
Right.
and subsequently there's a sharp decline. That's happened in other parts of Africa, like Lesotho as well. So I think building industrial capacity on the basis of preferential market access, which is not guaranteed over the long run, is quite a risky strategy. And I think what happened here with the disagreement on the banned second-hand clothing is an illustration of that.
It's a very positive and concrete scenario.
Well, no, I mean, I think the important factor to take home from this is that the way to go is to have more intra-regional trade.
All right.
Which is binding, you understand, between countries where tariffs are permanently reduced or eliminated, rather than depend on preferential market access with blocks outside Africa whose terms may suddenly change.
Right. Speaking of preferential markets, Nigeria was one of them, and of course they were among the ones that we discussed before that said that they did not want at least a free movement of people. But now they're coming around, and we've seen the government trickle down to say this is necessary. So in that event, how does that now affect most of the other conversations we've been having? Nigeria is a superpower that had said no. Now is saying yes. So what does that mean for the gravity of a possible momentum?
Well, it's very important that those larger countries are fully on board with the Continental Free Trade Area, quite obviously. So the fact that South Africa and Nigeria didn't initially sign up was a bit of a disappointment, but I understand the rationale that was given, that they needed to have more internal dialogue on this matter. Right. And we're hopeful going forward. As you see, the change of position of Nigeria is a positive sign, is it not? Those countries are sometimes fearful of the impact in terms of larger imports, right, and perhaps transshipment of goods from other countries, third countries. So, for example, Chinese imports has been raised in the case of Nigeria as a concern, that it would be Chinese exporters that would be benefiting rather than African countries. So it's definitely true there's an issue there with the rules of origin and transshipment to avoid that being the case. But at the same time, I think all the simulations of the outcome of the Continental Free Trade Area show quite clearly that the largest beneficiaries would be those largest countries.